Tēnā koutou, ka mihi mahana, kia koutou.
A very warm welcome to this workshop, an IPCC outreach on new ideas about how to talk, teach and write about climate change. It's a pleasure to be hosting this panel today at a time which marks the 30th year of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change's formation. I'm Bronwyn Hayward. I'm an Associate Professor in Political Science and International Relations here at Canterbury University. I'm a lead author for another team of writers on the IPCC, but today we're talking on the occasion of the arrival of 120 climate scientists who are working for the IPCC on land use and climate change here in Christchurch next week. I would also like to thank our co-hosts, the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse and Gas Research Centre from Wellington, who is co-hosting tonight's event, along with the New Zealand Royal Society, but also for the whole event, Ngā Tuahariri and Ngāi Tahu, and the Christchurch City Council, the Ministry for Environment, MB and MPI. And particularly thanks to the IPCC for thinking about offering this discussion at a time of a lot of busy work for the IPCC. And also at a time when many of us as students, journalists, teachers, parents, grandparents and researchers and citizens are worried about how we think about, confront and even talk about climate change. With recent record temperatures and severe weather events causing flood and coastal damage, many citizens of all ages are reporting an increase of anxiety and confusion and depression. So how can we effectively teach and talk about climate change, moving the issue beyond the inertia that comes of despair and fear to something practical and action-orientated? So we're pleased to be joined in this difficult problem with a fantastic panel who I'll kick off introducing one at a time when they speak. But our first and keynote speaker is Head of Communication from Working Group 3 for IPCC, Marion Ferrat. Marion is Head of Communication and Stakeholder Engagement for this working group, which assesses the options for reducing climate change. She worked previously as a specialist on energy and climate change for the UK Parliament during the Cameron government's period. She's also led parliamentary engagement and capacity building in Brazil, Morocco and Myanmar. She previously worked as a climate modeller for Beijing, and she holds a PhD in paleoclimatology and climate modelling, but also a master's in climate science and geophysics, and I don't know how she's put it all this in Imperial at London. You can read more about Marion's own work on her environmental blog 4 Degrees, and she's written many articles for websites including Carbon Brief, Felix, the European Geosciences, and also articles for Earth Science and Engineering. And she's based, when she's not working for the IPCC, she's also based at Imperial College. So please join me in welcoming Marion to Christchurch. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Bronwyn, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm really excited about this event tonight, and I'm really excited that all my colleagues will be joining me next week as well. And thank you very much to Christchurch, to the university for hosting us as well. And again, thank you all for coming. And I'm really excited about talking about a topic that's been really close to my heart throughout my sort of scientific career and all the different roles that I've had, which is how to kind of engage with people about climate change. And I'm also very excited to hear about what the other panelists tonight. I am a little bit jet lagged, so if I stop making sense at any point, please just stop me, and I will try and sort of rewire. But I'm going to talk two separate things this evening. First of all, I thought I'd start by demystifying what the IPCC is a little bit, because I think it's quite a famous organization, but actually it's quite a complicated one as well, and it's quite an intricate. It works in quite an intricate way. So I just want to sort of pick it apart a little bit and explain how we work and ultimately why we're here. And the second part of my talk is going to be focusing on communication of climate change. First of all, talking a bit more about what the IPCC is doing, and how it's trying to improve on its communications as well. So my role, for example, is a new one. So I've been in post about 8 months, and I'm the first one to hold this post. And there's a similar role in each of the other 2 working groups as well. So we're really trying to work together across the whole organization to improve our communications as well. And then after that, I'll sort of take my IPCC hat off for a minute and just talk more broadly about my general experiences of communicating climate science and climate change research and what I think is important in doing so. Please do interrupt me at any point as well if you have any questions. But I'll just kick off really quickly. Actually, let me go back. Looking at all these acronyms, I mean, the IPCC is famous for not always being very communicable, and we are acronym heavy, and I'm going to try and put my advice into practice and sort of pick all of these acronyms apart. But if you look at the 3 acronyms at the top there, I mean, this is the language that we speak on a daily basis in the office. So we would say IPCC circle LAM2, and everybody would know exactly what we're talking about. And if you look at a lot of our communications, those sort of series of letters will be there. So I want to unpick them one by one. So first of all, what is the IPCC? So it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's the international body that assesses the science related to climate change and produces big assessment reports that you may have heard of. The I of IPCC means intergovernmental, and that means that it's not just scientists being part of the panel, it's also the 195 governments that sort of drive our work as well, and that the scientists have to interact with. So it's really a unique cooperation between scientists and policymakers to try and make these assessments as relevant to policymakers as possible. That word relevant is really important. So the IPCC is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And that's something that drives our work completely. So we can assess all the science that's out there, produce assessment reports, but we cannot say, you know, a particular government has to take this course of action over that one. That's up to the individual governments to do that. But as I said, there's 195 members on the panel, and about twice a year, the scientific leadership and the representatives of these governments meet to decide on the work program and to drive the work forward. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of the IPCC report or seen the assessment reports. Yeah, I see a lot of shakes in the room. And how do you find them? Do you find them easy to understand? Or, got a lot to love. Okay, well, we'll see later on how we can improve that. But yeah, so basically every 5, 6, 7 years, the IPCC produces an assessment report. And there's one for each working group, as well as a synthesis report that gets published afterwards as well, that sort of tries to tie it all together. So working group 1 looks at the physical science basis of climate change. Working group 2 looks at impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. And working group 3, which is the one that I work for, looks at climate change mitigation. So options for reducing the rate at which climate change is happening, either by reducing the emissions or increasing the sinks, CO2 sinks. So these reports, as I said, get published about every 5 to 7 years. And on top of the big chunky report, there is also a summary for policymakers that gets published. And that's a really important document because, as I said, the IPCC is this cooperation between policymakers and scientists. And ultimately, the policymakers start and end the process. So any IPCC report that gets published will start with the policymakers. So the whole panel will decide that a particular report will be published, either an assessment report, or we also do special reports on specific topics that are of particular interest to governments. So the world governments will sort of sit down and agree on that topic. And then at the end of the cycle, or when a report gets published, the policymakers will also agree line by line the summary for policymakers. And that's quite a difficult task at times, getting 195 countries to agree to a text. And that's where a lot of negotiation skills come into play as well. But these are just some photos from not the latest plenary, because that was last week in Paris, where we were at the 47th session of the IPCC. But this was in Montreal back in September at the 46th session, where the outlines of the 6th assessment report were agreed by the governments. So again, the scientists scope out a particular report and make a proposal as to what content should go into that report. And then the governments agree each chapter title and a series of bullet points within each chapter that the scientists will then have to cover. So you can see the photo on the top left is just the whole plenary. So each country has got a seat at the table, and then in the center on the podium, there's as the IPCC, the scientists or the support units, like the one that I work for. And even just negotiating the chapter titles and sort of bullet points of each chapter can take quite a long time. And here on the top right, you can see Working Group 1. And they're all smiling because they managed to agree their outline in a couple of hours, because physical science, it's maybe slightly more straightforward, whereas mitigation, as at the bottom here, it took us 13 hours to agree our outline, because it's slightly more political, some more sensitive issues, so it just takes longer to agree that language. So I think communications is at the center of the IPCC, just in that sense, because you have to take lots of scientists and a lot of policymakers and actually listen to each other and agree to these reports. So that was my first acronym, IPCC. Now SRCCL, we say circle just because it sounds nicer, but what does that mean? That means Special Report on Climate Change and Land. So this cycle is really busy for the IPCC. We're not just doing the 6th assessment report, we're also doing 3 special reports as well as a methodology report too. And one of these special reports will look at the interplay between climate change and land, and that's a really important issue. This is a quote from Deborah Roberts, who is a South African policymaker and is also co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2. And she says, land is fundamental to human well-being. It is the medium on which we live and influences the balance of power in politics. And ultimately, land is where we all live, and it's a lot of different issues related to land, and it's a source of a lot of emissions as well, but also a lot of opportunity for carbon sinks. So the special report, again, was agreed by governments back in 2016. It's really important, this dialogue, listening to what the policymakers also want. So there was a questionnaire sent out to all the governments by the IPCC to try and figure out what topics they might want covered. And we ended up with a chapter outline, with a report outline that you can see on there. So it's quite a broad-ranging report. It covers just the science of land climate interactions, so CO2 emissions, CO2 sinks, but also desertification, land degradation, food security. Agriculture will fall into that as well, which I know is a big topic here in New Zealand. And then looking at the links between all of these, the links between these and sustainable development, and also risks and opportunities too. So it'll be quite an interesting report to come out, and we're again delighted to be here next week to continue working on that report. And then finally, LAM2, what does that mean? It's an acronym that we use a lot, and it means Second Lead Author Meeting. So the way the reports actually get written, so once a report outline is agreed, governments put forward some names of scientists who actually go and write that report. And these are hundreds of scientists from all over the world. The IPCC has to be balanced geographically with respect to gender. It's always a mixture of scientists who have been on the IPCC before and new scientists to the process too. But there are hundreds of authors across all the reports and the 6th assessment report that get together twice a year to actually discuss how they're going to draft that and sort of plan their work. This is just a few stats on this special report, so who are coming next week. So there's 103 experts who are the authors, plus the IPCC kind of scientific leadership that is there as well. We're doing better than we were used to on gender balance, but we're not quite there yet, but still. So 32% of the authors are women, and roughly half from developed and developing countries, and almost 60% of authors have been on the IPCC before as well. This is just a photo of the authors at the first lead author meeting. So that took place in Oslo back in October. And that's really the first time that they all got together to sort of try and plan their work, discuss what topics they were going to focus on, and really start that drafting process. Then they all went away. They put together a very sort of first draft of the report, and now they're going to get together a second time to really finalize this first draft. And a really important part of the IPCC process is that, and what makes it really transparent and authoritative, is that these drafts then go out for expert review. And anybody who has anything to say about the report, or any expertise on any area of the report, can download it and comment on it. And every single review comment has to be addressed by the authors too. So they have a big task next week, which is actually to start producing this first order draft that will go out for review in the summer. And, it's a big endeavor because there are lots of scientists from all over the world. Each chapter has got a specific group of authors too, and this getting together in one place is really an opportunity for them to work across chapter as well, to look at sort of the report overall, to look at its narrative, at its structure, etc., and really get this draft going. An important thing that will happen next week as well is that the authors will start talking about what they might want to elevate to this summary for policymakers later on as well, which is this crucial document that will eventually be approved, hopefully by the governments at the end of the process. So hopefully that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of where we're at now and why we're here next week. But what I really want to focus on now is this question of communicating climate change, because it is not always easy. You know, it's a very big topic. It's sometimes quite overwhelming as well. I mean, you know, a lot of the things we hear about 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, you know, the end of the century, 2100. I mean, these are really big things that can be quite overwhelming sometimes. And I think there are lots of different ways to talk about climate change. So first of all, I just want to focus a little bit on what the IPCC is doing and has been doing over the course of its life. Oh, I should have added it's turning 30 this year as well, so we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the IPCC. But we're putting more resources into communications. So, I mean, one way of doing that is that there are these 3 new roles, one in each working group. And in the Q&A later, we can talk a little bit more about what that involves if anyone's interested. But it's really broad-ranging. It's everything from kind of external communications all the way through to supporting the authors, really upstream and kind of drafting these reports and thinking of their audience. But why is the IPCC putting more resources into communications? Well, I mean, we have been called unreadable and inaccessible for non-specialists. And I think there have been growing calls over the years to improve the communicability and the readability of these reports. Back in February 2016, there was a big expert meeting on communications for the IPCC as well, where we brought in experts from around the world to talk about communicating climate science and how the IPCC could do that better and embed communications more effectively within its process. Some of the recommendations from that expert meeting were that communications should be an integral part of the report process. So, you know, it's not this last-minute thing that you then hand over to a comm specialist to make something communicable. You have to think about it really, really early on in the process, and it has to sort of drive the entire work, and should start at the outset of developing an assessment report. Another recommendation was more effective outreach with a whole range of stakeholders of the IPCC as well, and try and integrate their views and, you know, what they want to get out of the report. Also to be a bit more reactive to the media too. That's really important too, to be able to interact with the media better. And also to communicate IPCC findings to the range of audiences. And the primary audience of IPCC reports are policymakers, but actually there are a lot of secondary audiences too that need to be sort of thought of, not just, for example, education specialists, but also the business sector, the finance sector, who are people who, you know, who are also looking at how to find solutions to climate change. So there's a lot of different ways that we're doing that. We're trying to engage much more on social media, for example, trying to listen to what people have to say about the IPCC. Something that we publish in each of the reports are frequently asked questions as well. So Working Group 1 on one of the special reports that we're producing, they're leading on that, on the organization of that report, and they put out a big questionnaire on social media as to what are frequently asked questions, because maybe what scientists think is frequently asked is not the same thing that's actually frequently asked. So they thought, okay, let's you know, ask out there what people actually want to know about. We also outsource. You know, the IPCC can't do all the communications, because at the end of the day, we're also quite restricted to what has been agreed by all the governments, and we have to be careful in our language, and that means that we can't maybe go as far as other people might do if they can take our products and take that step further. So we also work with other organizations to try and sort of outsource a bit of that communication as well. One of the things that, again, Working Group 1 has led on recently is a project with climate outreach, and they've put together a little handbook for IPCC authors about effective public engagement and effective communication. So hopefully that will be also something that the authors can use if they do outreach and they do more communications in their work. We also have a project with the University of East Anglia on enhancing the accessibility of data visuals, so of kind of graphics of the IPCC as well. We're doing more user testing of our graphics. There's a very famous quote in the IPCC circles, is that a good graphic can save 1,000 words, but an IPCC graphic takes 1,000 words to explain. So we're trying to sort of move away from that as well, and bringing in cognitive scientists and specialists who know what people want to get out of a graphic, and try and embed that again very early on in the process. So that's what we're doing. But now I just want to talk a little bit more broadly about maybe my experiences communicating climate science in my previous roles, and just in general, just from having discussions with people and with other specialists. I think there are 3 really important things that I try and think of. One is know your audience. And as I said, for example, the IPCC primary audience is policymakers, but scientists working on climate science might talk to a whole group of different people, or from anywhere. But it's really important I think no matter who you talk to, that you know who you're talking to and what issues are close to their heart as well. So, for example, here it might be more focusing on agriculture, but climate change impacts us all over the world and a lot of different sectors. And I think it's really important to know what interests your audience. So that can be anything from cities, climate change in urban settings is a big topic of discussion at the moment as well. And what might interest, I don't know, an audience in China might be a different one to in Africa, or a particular stakeholder group might want to know something slightly different. So I think it's just really important to know who your audience is. And here on the bottom left, we have the panel at the UNFCCC COP21, and that's, again, our audience are more policymakers, so we're trying to bear them in mind. I think the second really important thing is to remember that why do we care about climate change? Because ultimately it's not just about a planet, it's about us on the planet as well, and it's important to sort of tell a human story and actually connect to people and connect to what issues people really care about. And something that is often said is that most people understand the world through anecdotes and stories rather than stats and graphic. And that came out of this handbook for IPCC authors by Climate Outreach. And I think it's not just important to sort of relate to people, but also to show that scientists are people at the end of the day. And they're not sort of, far away people in a white lab coat, but they actually have stories to tell themselves. And, I think engaging by saying why you're interested in something and what makes you passionate about something is a really good way to engage as well. So here on the top right, you can see our two co-chairs, Jim Skia and Professor Shukla, who are the co-chairs of my working group 3, just sort of chatting at an IPCC session. One of the things that we're trying to do as well for us is on our blog, we've just started a blog, and we have this kind of Meet the IPCC series of blog posts as well, just trying to show the people, again, people behind the scenes, doing little interviews with different IPCC scientists, because we work with people from all over the world, and it's really, I think it's the best part of my job actually, to just get to work with all these fabulous scientists from all over the world and sort of help them tell their story as well. So if anybody's interested, we do have a blog that you guys can read. And this is just a photo from my PhD. Well, it's not from my PhD, but it's linked to my PhD. And it's just to show that using metaphors can also be really important. And something that I used to do a lot during my PhD was give talks at the Natural History Museum to the general public. So they were kind of free talks, and anybody who was in the museum that day could just walk in. And I used to do those talks about my PhD. And if I read you the title of my PhD, you'll see it's not the most obviously exciting thing in the world, and I had to write it down because I couldn't actually remember. But it was a long time ago. It was called Interpretation of Paleomonsoon Dynamics on the Eastern Tibetan Plateau from a 10,000-year-old peat record of dust deposition and regional atmospheric model circulation. So that's not the sort of jazziest title in the world. So I thought, okay, so how can I actually talk to people about this, and how can I make them interested in what I do, which was ultimately sort of drilling a peat core, so drilling a core on the Tibetan plateau, so peat, like a decayed plant, carbon dating it, so it was about 10,000 years old, and then sort of chopping it in layers, and at each layer looking at the chemical and physical composition of the plant, and specifically looking at dust that had fallen from the atmosphere, which had kind of tiny particles of sand from deserts from all over Asia, and at each layer, so at each point in time, you can measure that dust, and you can look at its chemical composition, you can see where it came from. And why is that important? Is because that tells you what the wind direction was. So if it came from a desert in the north, then the wind was blowing that way, in the south, in a different direction. And I sort of kind of thought, okay, so what metaphors can I use to explain that as well, and how could I relate that to people's everyday life? And I just said, well, you have dust. Well, I certainly have dust piling up on my shelves, and maybe if the dust that came from my kitchen was a different, color to the dust coming from my bedroom, I'd be able to see which part of my room was dustiest ultimately. And another really cool thing that I think worked really well is that I would actually bring my samples, and I would say, okay, so this is a bit of plant that's 10,000 years old. This is a bit of dust that came from thousands and thousands of miles away. 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, it looks different. It's got a different color. You can tell it's coming from a different place, and just sort of pass that around. And I think, I don't know, people used to respond quite well to that. So I think, yeah, using metaphors. I think using the human body metaphors is one that I liked to do as well on climate science. So talking about the connection between different parts of the climate system. Well, it's a bit like, your body's got lots of connections that you don't really know. You might hit yourself or pinch yourself somewhere and feel it somewhere else because of your nervous system. And I always think, well, the climate system is a little bit like that as well. So I think using these metaphors is really important. And then finally, teaching is something that has always been very close to my heart as well, and I used to do a lot of it both during my PhD and after my PhD, including teaching about science policy to engineering and sort of STEM students as well, and trying to get them to think about broader policy issues. And I think it's really important, or it was really important to me to talk about real-world issues and not just sort of lecture students, but actually get them thinking about real-world questions and putting them in situations. So, for example, I used to say, okay, I used to work in Parliament for a committee, and I used to brief MPs on particular topics. So what if you were the specialist on this particular inquiry, or something really topical coming up in politics at the moment? Okay, so how would you brief a minister on this issue? And actually giving them that as an exercise rather than a standard essay or something like that. They responded quite well to that, and just most of the class was just a big round table discussion of how they would approach different political questions and how they thought science could be brought into that, and what does it mean to be sort of scientifically, to be evidence-based and to be scientific in policy making, and just kind of linking it to a lot of hot topics that were going on in the news at the moment, I thought was very helpful. But I know there are much better lecturers than I am on the panel later, so I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say on that matter as well. Anyway, I think you've probably heard enough from me, and I might have gone past my 10 minutes. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A later as well. So thank you for having me.
You can see why I can't imagine how Marion has fitted all this in. Also, far be it from me to comment on our beautiful brand new building, but it is interesting, and I hope that teaching and communication might have changed, but consoles haven't. And so I'm sorry we're slightly trapped behind here. And if you can't see around the cameras, there are seats here and on the far side. But just to reiterate what Marion said, the most dramatic thing that I saw her colleagues do for the IPCC was to take on the plenary panel and to say, do you know that people don't understand what a greenhouse gas is? And an entire auditorium of scientists looked confused, and they said, most people in the world haven't even been in a greenhouse. Why don't you just call it heat-trapping gases? So a single profound shift in communication has been widely acclaimed, really, at IPCC. Now, our second speaker, Emma Palaka, it's a real pleasure to introduce. It's a hard act to follow, Marion, but Emma herself has fitted in so much in a short period of time. She's a doctoral candidate here at UC from Canada. From Tonga. She's working in the College of Education, possibly fitted in a few Canadian trips on the side, in education, health and human development. She's researching conceptualizations of local environmental issues with Year 10 science students. Prior to this, she was the winner of the UC College of Science Scholarship for her Bachelor of Science Honours in Environmental Science. So can you please join me in welcoming Emma? It's a pleasure.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you. Warm Pacific greetings on this very cold day. I can't say global warming is really on my mind at the moment, as I have a cold and the weather is quite cold. But we're here to talk about climate change and talking about climate change. I actually have a little twist to my presentation, which is that I would like to talk about what happened when I stopped talking and actually listened to other people about climate change. So climate communication is about giving space for people, to our neighbors, our elders, our students, our indigenous people, to tell their stories because they have valuable knowledge about place and environment. If we do this, then our way of relating to each other in society with this changing climate will be informed by the wisdom of generations who have gone before us. Our thinking, not only our solutions, will be weighted down and grounded in the voices of those who have lived through the changing climate that we are talking about. There's a lot of well-shaped poetic words there, but I would like to share with you some stories of my own experience listening about climate change in the Kingdom of Tonga, where I'm from. So once again, thank you to the organizers and to the other panelists for giving me the space to share a little bit of what I've learned. So climate communications, as I firmly believe, is not just one way from some experts to the public, although climate scientists do play an important role in society about shaping these conversations. I learned this as a biology teacher in my home country of Tonga last year, when I had the opportunity to take a small group of students who were more environmentally minded out to an area of coastal development. So as we were thinking about the costs of sustainable development in Tonga, and we can see the effects of climate change and sea level rise happening there already, as we were doing that, one of the students pointed out to me this in the background. Could I just ask if anyone here knows what this is? Yeah, a fish trap. So we call this in Tongan pa. It's a traditional fish trap that was there on the area where we were looking and talking about sustainable development in terms of tourism and the ecological history of this area, and also the climate change pressures and how that would all work together and how that would all play out. So one of the students, actually from a more rural village, pointed out to me how this spot works, which I'd like to share with you. So fish actually swim along this area. There's sort of a line of netting that's perpendicular to the coast, and fish swim along that and get trapped in the circular part there. And once they get inside, they cannot get back out again. So the fish are all trapped in there, and when it's low tide, fishermen can come and collect them. She also pointed out that the size of the openings in the netting are just big enough so that smaller fish can swim out again. And they can, if you're an ecologist, you'll be excited thinking they can replenish the area. And this is very sustainable. This is an example of traditional wisdom, of solutions that are already part of the culture in places in the Pacific. Solutions that I think we need to listen to as climate scientists when we're looking at solutions for climate change. So as teachers, we can be encouraged to read textbooks, follow international NGOs, which are all very good and helpful, but we also must not forget to listen and to seek out the voice of our neighbors, our elders, people who know these sorts of wisdom, and listen to them and incorporate that into what we're teaching. Also to make space for them in our classrooms, whether it's within four walls or in a setting like this, or outdoors, wherever it is, let's make space to listen. This is important, lest we only hear what is popular to say and miss out on what is wise to live. This type of knowledge or way of knowing has been called in literature traditional ecological knowledge or local ecological knowledge. And scientists have begun to see the value of this in mainstream science, this sort of knowledge as an oral record of history. They can see the values within these communities being birthed out of generations who have lived sustainably within these ecosystems. Some legends, some metaphors, some poetry, some songs, some dances, all are ways of these oral societies passing on knowledge about the environment. Some call it legend, we call it history. One grandmother really helped me to see this in the island of Hawaii. This island, some of you may be familiar, was hit with a Category 5 cyclone a few years ago. So Category 5 is the highest category in terms of magnitudes of cyclones. And I just want to point out, this is not a new thing in Tonga, although the frequency of them we notice is becoming, they're becoming more and more regular. So this grandmother, she took me out as I was there doing research on something else, and she took me to this coastal area and showed me where a house used to be. That's pictured here, and her name is Langlangi. She showed me where the sea level had risen to a point where the house had to be relocated. She pointed out to me which was in the sea, where they had parked one time when they came for a tangi or for a funeral. As I saw her move around there, lifting up her long Tongan skirt in the water, walking around, I saw the water, and in a moment, the struggles related to climate change became real to me, more than just reading reports. I was living through someone else's experience by listening to their stories. I realized that I had to move away from looking for instant solutions. I had to look at other people as experts of place, especially when their lifestyle has shown an interconnectedness between the sea and the land, uta and tahi. Only a generation or two ago, Pacific Islanders were using renewable energy sources. This is not to romanticize our history or say that we should all throw out our ovens and go back to burning coconut husks again. But it's just for us to keep in mind, for us people who are passionate about climate change and climate issues, maybe for some of us who are skeptics, that we need to make space to seek out the voices of people who know things that we would never be able to learn on Google, and we must seek a relationship with them. Perhaps as climate communicators, the most important thing we can do is to create spaces for stories, as our key speaker has already mentioned, not only for sharing them, but for listening to them. Let's listen to the stories of our grandmothers, of our tangata whenua. Let's make space in our hearts to listen, not only to tell. And let's listen not because it fits our agenda, but so we can live through their stories what we can only weakly explain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. On listening to stories, can I now introduce Dr. Daniel Collins, who's a hydrologist at NIWA. He trained in his PhD at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and his research looks at the movement of water through natural and human-modified water cycles with a particular focus on climate change. He's also been an IPCC author for the 5th assessment, and he currently leads several research programs on the impacts and implications of climate change and how our societies can adapt. Daniel is also having to listen and work with a range of scientists, the community and government in his current work, and also industry and the media. And he's talking now about how to expand our engagement.
Well, thank you very much, Bronwyn, for inviting me to speak. As Bronwyn mentioned, I'm a hydrologist. I'm a hydrologist at NIWA, though I was a contributing author to the last IPCC report, which means I'm not mentioned in the citations. That's okay. It was a fun process. And as Bronwyn mentioned, I'm a hydrologist. I work at there's some reverb. I work at NIWA, and the majority of the work I do is to look at how the water cycle changes, how it has changed, and how that might change in the future, primarily in relation to climate change. My primary audience has been central or regional government, but I talk, as Bronwyn mentioned, to public community groups, industry groups, media, and so forth. And so I've had to explore different ways of communicating and telling my science to a number of different audiences and using different languages and so forth. The science, all climate change science is complex, but you don't need to talk about it in complex ways. Scientists among ourselves might do so, but with everyone else, and sometimes even among ourselves, we don't need to. Telling the stories in simple ways is often better, but not too simple. How do we do this? Well, how I do it is I try and think of two broad things. First of all, as Marion mentioned, you try to put yourselves in the shoes of your audience, understand your audience and know where they're coming from. Frame the science that you're talking about, in my case, in ways that can resonate with the audience's backgrounds and aspirations, so they can put themselves into the topic. That ties them to the details. Are they fishers? Are they agriculturalists? Are they kayakers and so forth? It's easier to talk about local issues than it is global or far away topics. Another important thing is, after the framing, is to understand not just the big picture, but also the details of the science. It's not that you're going to communicate all of the details of the science to your audience. You're not. But if you know all the details and if you know the big picture, then you know what to distill and what to keep, so that you don't distort the message. That's going back to my point of keeping it simple, but no simpler. One example, and again, this ties in, I think, nicely to a point that Marion was making. When I talked to a lot of community groups, maybe this is not the technical audiences I'm meaning, I liked actually to talk about noisy pubs or bars. Now, I'm sure many of us have gone to a bar or a restaurant after work, maybe on a Friday, and it's been noisy, and it's been hard to hear conversations in your group. Detecting climate change is much like listening to a conversation in a noisy bar. That's my analogy. It's hard to do climate change science. We can talk about a lot of statistics, we can talk about things like time of emergence, but those are technical terms which aren't necessary and aren't helpful. But noise in a pub, we can probably resonate with that in New Zealand. And so that's the analogy that I'd like to talk about. It takes scientists many decades and have to look over the globe to gather the data to actually notice that there was climate change. Much the same as listening to a conversation in a noisy bar or a pub. It takes some time to hear what they're saying. Maybe they're speaking a different language and you have to move closer. Maybe they have to speak louder and eventually you'll hear the conversation. So that's much like the work of detecting climate change. And I use that analogy often when I'm talking to many different groups. It works, I find. A lot of people nod their heads, and I know a few of you have been doing that too. So I just use that as an illustration of taking a complex science concept, distilling it down to what is necessary and sufficient without going too far and without making it too simple. There are other stories and anecdotes I have as well. Humour. These messages are the same things any communicator is used to. Use humour to engage the audience, know your audience and so forth, simplify things, analogies, metaphors. Because I'm a hydrologist and I talk about floods a lot, there's a nice cartoon that I often present. Don't need to present it now, the words will suffice. That there are people who might doubt climate change more than others, and so there's a cartoon and two pictures. We have some people thinking about floods and climate change, and they say, talking amongst themselves, that, well, the projections suggest that floods will become worse in the future. And they say to themselves, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The next panel is a bridge, flooded. So it illustrates, it tells the story. It doesn't quantify that the floods will increase by 22%. Sometimes that's unnecessary. Oftentimes that's unnecessary and can get in the way of the bigger issues. So I'll leave it at that, brief though it may be, and look forward to more discussions with a wider panel.
Our next speaker, Dr. Deirdre Hart, is a senior lecturer here in geography at the University of Canterbury. She researches physical, biological and human, as in built environmental lifeline processes and interactions in coastal environments. This includes temperate and tropical coastal and river mouth science, engineering and management. At the moment, her international research projects include collaborations with Korea, New Zealand, Italy and the USA. Her research approach is multidisciplinary, but her experience both as a researcher and a tertiary teacher is very welcome. So Deirdre, it's lovely to introduce you today.
I've just had an epiphany. I'm the person that doesn't go to the pub very much, and I give up on trying to converse in the noisy conversations. And if only I'd had that analogy a while ago, I might not have got into this business. So I'm a lecturer in coastal science, but I'd say I'm a student of climate change communication. Partly a school of hard knocks, I would say, over the last 10 years or so. And I've got one slide here to help me with my talk. I'm going to talk around these three different concepts. And so the first one being climate. As a coastal scientist, I work within a small subdisciplinary team in geography, in between some climate scientists and meteorologists, then myself in the coastal and ocean space with another colleague, and then we have cryospheric and snow scientists within our physical geography team. We sit alongside humanities and geospatial computing geographers. So my area is very much coastal rather than land, and I know lots about the science, but I've had to learn lots about the communication in order to talk with people and have a conversation about that science. I do professional work outside in coastal science, outside the university, with communities and with government partners as well as engineering consultants, and I also teach about coastal studies and a little about coastal science. So that's my sort of context. And when I consider my 9 lectures at first year and how much climate science I can get through in my 9 50-minute lectures, leading up to trying to understand what's going to happen to coasts, what is happening to coasts, and what our role can be in that. There's quite a lot of material when you look at, just for example, the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. And I went online earlier today and I got the page numbers for the 3 main volumes, and then the synthesis report, but I've been told off referring to the synthesis report in professional communications, so we won't do that. So we've got about 4,629 pages worth of summary of science. This is not the science, this is about the science. The science sits behind that. It's absolutely enormous. We're in this information age where there is no shortage of material to work with. We're also in an era of alternative facts, post-truth, and I'm told post-science, although I'm not quite there yet. What do we do about this? I noted with amusement when you said that the physical sciences panel took a much shorter time to come to an agreement because it was slightly more straightforward were your words, and I thought that message hasn't got out there yet, that it is slightly more straightforward and that physical scientists are pretty much within the same bandwidth on this topic. And so when I think about how to communicate effectively, I have to consider that idea and then the perception of that out there in the public. I was also interested to hear about the audience being policymakers, which is obviously the main audience, but there are so many people that try to access and read these reports. In our coastal communities within Christchurch, first year students right through to graduate students, so the audience is really, really wide, and people are motivated to grapple with this stuff. For my own part, if I'm talking about the topics that I go through in my lectures, I've got to get through the RCPs, the regional concentration pathways, the climate models, to move on to things like the sea level scenarios. So that's an awful lot of material to get through, and I've got 9 lectures at first year to get through it. And in no other type of lecture is there so much available misinformation and so much mythology and so much controversy. In other areas that I teach in, we work to give a really good grounding in the information that's available and in the skills you need to use that information. So you might study the geomorphology of sediments and the biology of the critters that make them in a reef environment in detail, so you can build up a bank of knowledge and you get your study skills. But I think we need a different set of skills on top of that in this area to be emphasised. They are skills within normal science, but they are skills that have a different emphasis in climate change communication. And these are skills to address and unpack the evidence and the myths, the Google stuff, as well as the material that the reports are based on. And so I've sort of shifted my teaching in this area to go through a certain amount of science, but to focus on discernment as a skill in going through that science, and to go through it more rapidly than I would other science, but to go slowly with the discernment, to focus on that as the skill. And then to get into the myths. When I started teaching, we sort of didn't give much airtime to the myths because we thought it was wrong to give airtime to the myths. But now I deliberately give airtime to the myths. And the first myth, I guess, my head of department is a climatologist, and he said to us a few years ago, you can't say change anymore if you're a climatologist, because one of the things that people say is that climate's been changing forever. And so all the climate scientists are now saying disruption. But I still say change because that's a language that's common. But I address that issue of disruption, anthropogenic disruption, and where's the evidence for a difference in this climate change? Let's look at that evidence and focus in. And we can actually employ the myth to know what kind of evidence we need to focus on once we've outlined the basics. I've seen a few tweets about the weather being cold coming from America, and that how can climate be changing and warming if the weather's cold? And so there's good material there for unpacking the science, and we can actually start to use those mythologies and the misinformation to good effect. Sea levels have been higher. We can look at the sea levels and we can try and understand the data, and we can analyse it and do a little bit of statistics and science courses around that. But we also have to address the idea that it's not sea levels that are rising, it's satellites that think they're rising. So we have to look at the instruments and the methods that we measure the evidence via. And we have to address how robust, what can we tell using satellites, what can't we tell, what are the gaps, and face that information head on as a part of this mythology. Uncertainty is a great one that I used to feel uncomfortable and avoid, and now I think it's something that we need to talk about. I'm really comfortable talking about the narrow band of uncertainty in the sea level science compared to the enormously wide band of uncertainty in human behaviour that needs to feed into that science. And these are things we've got to take head on. A Christchurch example, that things like sea level rise and climate change are a beach issue. I'll still be standing out there on the beach looking at the ocean, but inland up the rivers and in the former swamp, it'll be saturated whilst I'm still watching the ocean, because it's more complicated and it depends on which setting you're in. So you've got to ground it in your own setting. So then I get on to the last word here, which is the communication, the area that I'm more of a student in. And what I've learnt with climate change communication is that once we've dealt with a little bit of the science and a lot of the skills you need to discern evidence versus mythology, then you've got to move quite fast to solutions. I'm an earth scientist, and in earth science, doom and gloom's really easy. And I've done doom and gloom, and it doesn't work. It's incredibly disempowering and disengaging. And you do doom and gloom to a bunch of 19-year-olds, and people just switch off or get anxious or depressed and walk away. They leave the pub conversation. But to keep people in the conversation, to move to the solutions, we've got to be positive, and we've got to focus using our discernment again on what possible solutions could be. Again, that discernment is very, very key, because there are a lot of funny ideas out there about solutions, but there are a lot of fabulous ideas, and there are a lot of things like the traditional knowledge that Emma's brought up tonight, and technologies which can help us, but we need to be very discerning. I'd say mostly discerning about the technologies. What I've also learned in this communication category is that, as well as being empowering and engaging, we've got to be ethical. And in being ethical, we've got to call out where our colleagues are not being so ethical, where they're not being so professional. And I've had some really hard conversations with a few coastal scientists over recent years, calling spades spades. And I think we've got to be not scared of doing that. The other thing we've got to be is we've got to be a whole person. So I'm a mum, I'm a teacher, I'm a scientist, and I've got to bring all of those elements into my understanding about climate change. If I was just here to be a scientist and to advance my career, I think I wouldn't touch climate change. I think I'd go and look at other topics. It would be a lot more easy. And I'm interested in climate change because I'm really interested in intergenerational equity. And so we've got to bring that element, we've got to be honest about that element and honest about our motivation for communicating this science. We are allowed to have opinions. We've got to be honest about where they're expert opinions and when they're about some other sphere in our life. So be a whole person, be ethical, be empowering, be engaging, and a little bit less of the doom and gloom, much more of the discernment. Those are my messages.
Last, but by no means least, as they say, we have Rebecca McPhee, who is an award-winning journalist who's written about business, environment and social issues for 3 decades. She's been a senior writer with The Listener from 2007 until Monday, yesterday. And she's just about to start a new chapter in her writing. But in 2017, she was awarded a Wolfston Fellowship by the Newspaper Publishers Association to Cambridge University, where she researched financial, economic and policy responses to climate change. It resulted in a series of major articles which have been published by the listener. She's also author of Tragedy in the Pike River Mine, for which she won the Jessen Journalism Award for her account of the 2010 mine disaster in which 29 men died. It's a pleasure to invite Rebecca to give some remarks at the end of this panel and then open up for discussion. So Rebecca, thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Bronwyn. Is that working? Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to have to read from my laptop here because I ran out of printer ink today and I couldn't print it, and I don't know how to do PowerPoints. So I'm not an expert on anything really. I'm a generalist, as most journalists are. We're generalists that have to learn ridiculously quickly, often about really difficult topics. And climate change is the ultimate tough story. They don't get, and they haven't ever been, any more complex than this. And I want to talk through with you one of the reasons from a generalist journalist point of view why it is so tough. One is, it is not one story. It's many, many stories, interlinked, interdependent, intergenerational, and each piece of that is highly challenging and complex in itself. So it's the ultimate wicked problem. And wicked problems are incredibly difficult to write about through a news forum, and even through a long form forum, which is what I generally do. So, you know, a question like, you know, how do you cover climate change as a journalist is a bit like asking, you know, how much you have covered the Industrial Revolution. I mean, clearly it's not one story, because we're talking about an entire global system, not only an entire global climate system, but an entire global economic system. And of course, the solution, or the mitigation to climate change, requires an economic revolution. We don't say that very much. I don't think we say it enough. I increasingly say it because I think that is true. It requires a complete retooling of the economy. And as to the complexity, it's actually more complex than what it would have been like to have covered the Industrial Revolution had one been a journalist at the time. The complexity is at every level. There's the science itself is vast, as Deirdre was saying. There's just so much material. I mean, every time I enter into a new story, you know, I just can't avoid. You go in thinking, right, you're going to be really disciplined, not going to get down too many rabbit holes here, you know, and I end up with this much, you know. There's just so much material, and because it's so available, I was saying to Marion before, I kind of, you know, my heart sinks every time I know I've got to open a IPCC policy summary for policymakers report to make sure I'm exactly right on some reference, because it's terribly, terribly dense. So what happens for journalists who write a lot about climate issues is there's a tendency to sort of write a lot about a bit of it. So there's the science of what's happening to the climate. So some journalists tend to specialise in that part of the story. There's the question of the technology. What are the technologies going to be? What are the renewable energies? What are the transport systems going to be that are going to mitigate the effects of carbon dioxide pollution? So some journalists tend to focus on that piece. There's extreme weather and its impacts and sea level rise, which is, you know, the gigantic adaptation story, and some people tend to focus a lot about that, you know, the reporting on the cyclones. We've got Gita, we've got messes in Tasman, and you tend to get a lot of sort of reactive journalism to those specific events, quite rightly. And then there's the question of the level of economic transformation that has to occur, because what we're needing to do is get off one fuel source that underpins the entire world economy and has done for a couple of hundred years. 81%, I read yesterday from the IEA, 81% of the world energy system is still reliant on fossil fuels. So we have to get off that to zero emissions. So these are just enormously sweeping, large, complex, head-hurtingly difficult things to write about. So they're too big to get your arms around as a journalist, even as a long-form complex journalist who writes about complex stuff. So you break it up. But what I try and do, I can never do enough of because there is never enough time, and I know that other journalists who are really committed to writing about climate issues try and do this too, is that you have to think about it as a complete interlocking system. You have to approach the research with a sense through your wider reading of it being a completely interwoven economic, social and climatic system. And then within that broader understanding, you go hunting for the new material, the new understanding, the new science, the new ways of thinking about the issues, the new evidence and the new experience, the personal, the highly personal anecdotes, which are absolutely critical. I mean, everybody needs stories, and stories have to be about people. But it's then the human stories have to then provide a pathway to the raw knowledge. So what really works when it comes to reporting on climate issues? I mean, I've just described how I see the problem, which is enormous. What works? Look, I don't know, I'm afraid. I have written literally tens of thousands of words on climate issues. I don't know. As a journalist, I don't know how a reader is responding to the way I've written about something on, say, climate litigation, or what the latest research is on extreme weather and the link with climate change, and the whole emerging issue of science around attribution. I don't know. I mean, I'm flying blind. We're flying blind. I'm not there on the couch when somebody opens their copy of The Listener to see how they respond. I don't know. The one thing my goal as a writer is to think that somebody's reading my story and gets to the end of it and thinks, yeah, okay, I see. That's what I want, because that means I've helped them appreciate something new that they didn't already understand before, or help them to understand what they don't understand a little bit more, but some kind of little piece of recognition. That's what I yearn for, but I don't know. I have no idea whether that's what happens. Because what I want is for the reader to think, I get that now, and that then maybe has some kind of knock-on, and perhaps it's the way they think about the way they live their life, the way they think about how some politician is talking about some issue that's related to energy or the environment or coastal risks or whatever. But the fact is, I don't know. So I follow my instinct, and other reporters follow their instincts as well. It's just an incredibly challenging issue from a traditional journalistic point of view as well. This is not so true for me. It's somewhat true for me even as a long-form writer, but if you're a journalist who's in the daily kind of news world, the news machine is always going to tend to want to go to reactive comment, reactive reaction to keep stories rolling. So it'll always tend to gravitate to the responses of known and identifiable stakeholders in a story. So, for instance, a regulator that tries to bring in coastal hazards rules to protect the interests of future property holders is going to face a barrage of media stories quoting the perspective of current property owners who stand or who feel they stand to lose something, either the value of their property or some sense of security or some sense of place. When a government tries to talk perhaps openly about the possibility of ending oil and gas exploration, for instance, the news stories are going to inevitably go to and emphasise the views of current stakeholders, which are going to be the companies that have a huge amount of money and assets tied up in oil and gas exploration, and the communities that rely on that downstream for their well-being. It's not that those interests are not legitimate interests, but one thing that is really difficult, but I think is the most important thing of all as a journalist covering these sorts of this issue, is that they are not the only stakeholders. This is an intergenerational story, and so we have an obligation to think about stakeholders that are too young to be heard. Maybe they're not born yet. Of course, many are not born yet. It is not the normal story where somebody in power wants to do something, somebody's losing something, it's kind of a zero-sum game. Somehow we have to learn how to tell this story in the public forum of the media that recognises its intergenerational nature, that recognises and confronts the fact that it is a radical economic shift that is required, that it is a revolution that's required, because we are having to shift from the fuel that drives our economy now to another type of fuel to drive an economy in the future, and it will require us to live differently. So I haven't been able to give you any answers. All I can reflect really is the struggle, I suppose, that I try to manage in the way I approach these stories. I'm not there yet. I've tried to experiment with a number of different things. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if what I'm doing is successful or works. But one thing I always come back to at the end of the day when we talk about, you know, how does the media deal with climate change is Lord Deben from the UK Climate Commission says about communicating climate change, you just have to go on and on and on about it. Thank you.
So our marvellous panel didn't go on and on, which has given us time for some questions, because there's also enormous expertise in the room, not wanting to enter the realms of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, but we do know, because you emailed, quite a lot about who's here and the diversity of backgrounds in journalism and science and community advocacy and teaching. So some people who couldn't be here have emailed questions, and the panel tonight is being both recorded by Plains FM for community radio, and we're also making the podcast available through UC and through the Royal Society's websites. So if you don't want to have your question filmed, or yourself, just you might want to shuffle to the back, but we will take a few questions. But first I've got a couple that have been emailed in, which I thought I might put to the panel just for brief comment, and then we'll open it up to the floor if that's okay, and then we'll follow with a drink and something to eat outside. At a personal level, this isn't a normal topic. This is a difficult topic to deal with. How do you cope emotionally with the demands of the work, the research, and the reality of what you're doing? Marion.
Thank you. Well, it's a tough question, and it is a demanding topic. It is a demanding job, I suppose. I think that we all do, but I certainly find mine quite challenging. I mean, I suppose hope is always you know, you have to kind of trust that that you're doing something good, and that you know, that things will move on, and I think that should drive you, sort of trust and hope as well.
That's a challenging one. I try and separate in a way myself from the topic. As a scientist, I see my role as dispassionately as possible analysing and communicating science, and yet I'm also a non-scientist at the same time. So. Being a taxpayer-funded scientist, my job is to get the science out to you all without polluting it with my biases. Or if I have biases, and we all do, try and make them obvious. So I do try and separate. I've got work to do as I see it, and I'll do that as best I can. And then if people at the pub, in a noisy pub, ask me about my opinions, I'll also share what those are. But in a way, I try and separate myself, seeing myself as a scientist and seeing myself as separate, as best I can.
It is a really difficult one. I think when you can work with a topic and be productive about it, in my case writing about it, it does give you a conduit for your any kind of stress or anxiety that you might otherwise have about it. I think it's a lot harder for people who have a lot of worry about climate change but kind of feel helpless. I can't do much, but at least I can write. And I'm also probably helped by the fact that because I have to deal with so much information, I spend quite a lot of time exposed to all the trend material around renewables and how rapidly things are changing, which is quite hopeful without being Pollyanna-ish. You know, the thing is, we do know how to do this. It's just whether we choose to.
That is a hard question, and I used to have your silo, but working in education, that disappears quite fast. One of the enormous benefits that you have though working in education is being surrounded by people who want to make a difference and people who want to learn. So that is incredibly an inspiring environment to be in. And as a new scientist, you could descend into the doom and gloom of evidence, but you are constantly dragged back into this much more positive reality of the people around us who are trying to learn, who are trying to make a difference. And just observing that, I'm always surprised by how much we can do when we forget that we can't do it.
Similarly to Dr. Deirdre here, I think in education it's inspiring to look at the potential of your students. So my own students, year 13 biology class last year, they inspired me to even finish my studies and continue on researching how curriculum can address this better.
I can't get to the panel tonight, I live too far away, but I wanted to ask the panellists. I'm a teacher. My community classroom is diverse. The students come from backgrounds in dairy farming, backgrounds in tourism, particularly working with Air New Zealand, backgrounds in working in other areas of community activism. What have you learnt about listening to and working across deep differences in a community? So, do you want to pick up the listening?
Thank you again for that question. I think diversity is nothing to be afraid of. I think in the classrooms they're just opening their eyes to realize that the classroom has never not been diverse, but now we're just working with it as a strength rather than seeing it as a challenge. So I think providing space as a teacher could look like before starting a topic, say on local river ecology or whatever, ask the kids, whatever age they are, what's their experience of their local rivers or their local beaches. Ask for stories, could give them time to go and research that and have them come and share in class, which will actually help you when you get to the facts and figures, for them to see how science is always localized. We can't say climate change impacts always look like this, but they look like everything you have been talking about, if that's appropriate.
I think embracing diversity is really important as well. And you mentioned dairy farming. No non-dairy farmer has all the answers about how to fix our water issues. We need the dairy farmers in the conversation too. And that just is an analogy. We need the coal burners and the fossil fuel users in the conversation as well. And if we bring our critiquing, our discernment and our evaluation of what everybody brings to the table, then having multiple partners with really different perspectives helps to add different tools to the solution. But we also need to sit across the table and to listen to the people on the other side to understand where they're coming from. Because that's often where the blockages to moving towards the solution is understanding where each person's coming from.
Yes, I mean, diversity is inevitable. I guess as a journalist I get to be the one that has to talk to everybody. I usually find everybody is utterly reasonable, and if the everybody could sometimes be all together being reasonable, that would be quite progress making, I think. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge, just back to what I said before about whose interests, part of that discernment, I think, Deirdre, I would add to yours, is some people have more immediately at stake and are going to fight harder for that, and that has to be weighed into the conversation and the solutions, and some people are not there yet but they have an interest.
So in my work I talk with a lot of stakeholders across New Zealand sectors. Freshwater is a big deal in New Zealand, as Deirdre mentioned, in terms of water quality, but also water quantity. And so I talked with people in the hydropower sector, irrigators, agriculture, cities and so forth. And I've been doing this recently, actually talking to members of these communities, asking them, what does climate change mean to you? How can we help you deliver science that's useful for you? So this goes back to my point and many of our points about talking to our audiences and understanding what they want to hear. So that is, again, embracing diversity, embracing and listening all the time to what they say, and then basically negotiating and co-learning the questions.
Thank you. And I think I'll just echo what all the panelists have said already. I think diversity is absolutely critical, and this is me talking in my own personal capacity rather than on behalf of the IPCC. But I guess my experience when I moved out of science and into policy has always been to, well, first of all, to realize that policymakers have different things in mind to maybe what physical scientists sort of think about as well, and just sort of understanding where they're coming from was really important. And when I was in Parliament, I was working for policymakers across party, so I was working for a committee that had lots of different political perspectives as well, and I think it was just really important to listen to all views and to try and find solutions by understanding where everybody's coming from. I do think it's absolutely critical.
So at this point, we're going to open up for questions, and what we thought we might do is take 2 or 3, and could they be pithy?
I'm a 350 activist, and I've been involved in dealing with social media and mainstream media news threads and comment columns for the last 4 years. I estimate I've probably spent 2 months online, literally. Question. Megan Woods, who's now a minister, was an MP at the time she raised this point. She said she longed for the time when she could go into a working men's club somewhere in New Zealand and get a decent hearing on climate science, because there is, I guess, 40% of the population, 30% maybe, who simply will not engage with it, who are absolutely opposed to any contemplation of it because it will affect their lifestyle. I would love to know, I have my own methods of dealing with that, but I would love to know what other people's thoughts are. I
gave a presentation at Imperial College at a conference on climate risk in mining, oil and gas last year. And, sorry, but at the end of the conversation, all the questions and answers, most of the discussion was around the science rather than actually being able to mitigate the risk. How do we actually focus the conversation on mitigating these risks rather than sort of sorting out the science, because that's where everything's going to come in, and especially being quite young, how can I bring that into my science to deliver my presentations better?
We've been talking about diversity and everybody needing to be heard and so on and so forth, but I don't think we can wait to convince everybody. Okay, we have not got much time, and maybe to sort of link over to the person at the back with the question about what's it all for. I mean, we know what it's all for, and the Paris Agreement actually gives us a platform for that. We know that the end point, well, not an end point, but we know we must reach net zero carbon emissions by the second half of the century. That's a non-debatable point, and everything else follows from that. as for the people in the Working Men's Club who don't want to change their lives, I mean, what policy has changed how people have been able to live their lives since forever? I mean, men didn't used to want women to have the vote. Smokers used to want to be able to smoke at work. All of these things have changed and can change. I don't see that actually as any kind of an obstacle. Yes, you try and, you know, it has to be inclusive and all the rest of it. But again, you know, the men at the Working Men's Club are not the only stakeholders.
I don't go out to communities all the time. I'll go out if I'm invited generally. And I have run into occasionally members of the audiences who might deny to some degree the science of climate change. I also am a semi-avid reader of comments online. Not to engage in them, but I consider them good indicators of outliers of community sentiment. They're not a good sample of the community as a whole, but they're good outliers. And sometimes I see, oh, this is an interesting, where did they get that idea from? And so it's a way of helping me reframe and to see what I have to say. But I don't worry about some of these outliers because they're in a minority. I must say that I don't have the thick enough skin, perhaps you do, to engage head on with people who deny science. But I'm not personally not so worried about that. I think the majority populace is on board with the general sentiment at least. To your point, really important. The physical scientists like myself, it's really easy for us to talk to each other about the science because we have the same jargon almost. I was talking with a journalist some years ago when he was writing a New Zealand geography article. In the end, after the record, he asked me what the biggest challenge in freshwater science was, and I said physical scientists working together with social scientists. We don't have the same jargon and the same language, and so it's hard for us to work together. That means it's hard for us to work out how to mitigate and adapt, which it's not just about mitigation here. We've committed to climate change already, and so we also have to work out how to adapt. So we need indeed to get the physical science right, but we also need to work out how to talk among ourselves, among the physical scientists and social scientists and then the community. So that's my perspective of what work I do now.
My question is related to Rebecca's point about perhaps not knowing how your articles are taken by your audience, and also Marion talking about what the IPCC is doing, and whether or not within that handbook on effective communications, is there anything about gauging the success or the effectiveness of the communications that you're putting out?
What can we do to empower people to A, react and go, oh, there is a problem, and then how do we go forward to communicating solutions in a positive or at least less doomsday light?
I'll just start with the question about what the IPCC is doing and what's in that handbook. And the other thing that I talked about beyond the handbook was like graphics, and user testing is very much part of that, and that is very much about sort of gauging what your audience thinks about particular graphical representation. So again, bringing in some social scientists and cognitive scientists in that process, we're very much hoping to do more of that.
When I gave my doom and gloom a couple of lectures over the years, I think I forgot my role, or I didn't realise my role, and I got down all the scientific rabbit holes and I focused on all the science. But people can access that themselves, it is there, and I forgot that as scientists in all of our areas, we also work on solutions, testing solutions, evaluating solutions. So like in the coastal area, we might have things like different ways of managing sand beaches, different ways of managing estuarine shorelines, different ways of managing how our community interacts with those shorelines, things like dunes, things like engineered structures, planning solutions, ways of addressing the pattern of land use in an environment. And those are already in our toolbox, and we just have to bring them to this conversation and to spend a little bit less time in the rabbit holes and more time using the tools that we already know we have, and then being inspired by what our students come up with as other solutions.
Yeah, in terms of doom and gloom, I would ask who's doom and gloom, because for some it's not a prediction, it's already happening. The family who lost their house, for example. They've already had to be relocated. So I think cultivating resilience is really useful in the sphere of education, and letting someone live in someone else's shoes, which goes back to the idea of diversity. In terms of doom and gloom, yeah, we have to realize that some people are already reaping the consequences of our actions, and we can't avoid it. But we can listen to them and learn more about it, and maybe we'll find more meaningful ways of talking about it through listening to them.
This kind of climate change, young people thing seems like it's essentially you've got to convince people to give something up, right? So what I was interested in your positions as climate change leaders, advocates, what have you personally been willing to give up, and how do you think you can convince young people, other people to give things up as well?
An observation. First of all, I'm very confident in the young. I think they've really got the message and they're very well informed. I'm also exceedingly familiar with the attitudes that come across in the Working Men's Club, and worse still from Grey Park. However, my question really is, how do you get a majority consensus among the people to persuade the policy makers and the politicians to engage in a way and set the policies when they've got their minds on an electoral cycle of 3 years?
I mean, on giving things up, I suppose I've been very privileged in the sense that I've not necessarily in my own personal life, had to give things up yet. But I think maybe it goes back to that frame of opportunity as well, and sort of looking at maybe there are a lot of changes that we just haven't anticipated yet. The pace of technological change is really rapid as well, and there are maybe just a lot of things that we don't anticipate. So, we might not have to give up as much as we think we do now.
In terms of giving up, I would rather be doing different types of science, to be honest. I actually possibly enjoy going back and being a historian. So that's the kind of thing that I would give up. I do this because it's my job now. I do enjoy it, but I think it would be more fun to do some other topics. If I can jump on the doom and gloom. A lot of people like to frame climate change perhaps the Manhattan Project of this generation. I don't like the Manhattan Project idea, given what that connoted, but I think reframing it as the Apollo Project perhaps of this era. Reframing it as that, and a lot of great things came from that.
I don't consider that I've given up anything, but I have made a large number of changes, because once you start sort of immersing yourself in climate stuff, I don't know how you can not. So that's my bike over there. I try not to ever drive a car around town. I hardly ever eat meat anymore. I kind of pretty cautious about long haul flights. I offset all my domestic flights. Try and use that energy in the middle of the night when it's off peak, so that I'm not peaking up the peakiness, which is what drives coal-fired generation. It's not because I think personal action is the change, but I do think personal action is, you can't know this stuff and then not do something about it at a personal level. You can't live with yourself anymore. Certainly couldn't live with my kids anymore. But I also think there is a political power about personal action, because it then reverberates through your community. Your friends, you talk about it with your friends, they talk about it with their friends. Somehow or other it seeps through the wallpaper of communal life, and eventually I think that changes the culture of the conversation. Yeah. On Margaret's question, I mean, the answer clearly is the Climate Commission and a Zero Climate Act that deals with the intergenerational nature, and it has to be a cross-party agreement.
I've had to give up a lot of what I've learned. So I've learned that things are really hard, and that some things are near impossible, and no, with logic we can't do that. And when I talk to young people in particular, they're like, oh, problem? Well, okay, let's just do a solution. And I've had to start to believe that that might be possible. And that is quite challenging for a scientist who bases everything on, oh, well, this came before and then we have that step next. That challenge, that revolution, that paradigm shift takes a while to sink in. On a personal note, I'm a coastal scientist and I love beaches. I would love to live on a beach, but I never will.
Thanks for the question. I really like the way you framed it in terms of leadership linking into lifestyle. Yeah, this Christmas I announced to my family I'm giving up plastic straws after going to this what do you call it? Like a museum kind of thing in Chicago, and they did a presentation on that. So my sister decided to give me these reusable straws and all that for Christmas or for my birthday, which I started to realize people around you actually notice the changes that you want to make. Even if I've used a few straws since then, I've forgotten my sister's gift at home. But also just wanted to mention someone who really impacted me, and that is Russell Taylor. Some of you may know, who used to work in biology here, who actually was instrumental in bringing me over from Tonga on scholarship. My first few weeks here, he was walking me up the old biology building that's gone now. And I remember I was excited to take the elevator because we don't have elevators in Tonga, we didn't at the time. So I was looking forward to going the elevator to go to get to the upper floors, but instead he took the steps. And I was really disappointed, and I thought, man, why would you, if you have the option to do something easy, why wouldn't you use it? But he was, kind of leaving a rock in my shoe, getting me to think about, even when you have the option, maybe you can choose not to.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank both the questions from the long view to the questions about what we do, but I especially want to thank our panel. It's extraordinary and a lot of wealth of knowledge in the room, but here. And I particularly want to thank Marion, who is so jet-lagged and hasn't explained that she organised and had to run the 30th celebrations in Paris for the IPCC as well. But all of our speakers, it's been great. If you've enjoyed this session, there are a few seats if you would like to email Sylvia Nissen that people have given up from the main plenary panel, which will be on Wednesday night in the Piano Centre between 7 and 8 o'clock. But also, and he's in the room so I can thank him, Tony Moore from the City Council has done an extraordinary job with Gap Filler and other community groups in setting up a pop-up climate fair, pop-up Christchurch Climate Exchange, which will run on Wednesday from 10:30 till 7 o'clock before the debate, so that climate scientists and the community can see some of the local initiatives, see some of the science and the research that students are doing from Canterbury and Lincoln and other places. So if you can come down or tell your friends, it's in the park beside the Piano Centre, and also take in the extraordinary mural that the City Council has created, along with a very young 17-year-old poet, on a poetry climate walk that runs between the Crown Plaza Hotel and the Piano Centre as street art on climate. So come down on Wednesday, that's opening. We're hoping to have poetry reading on the street at 12:30 on Poets and Climate. But now could I ask you to join me in thanking our speakers very much.